You are listening to Frog Talk, presented by D.R.I.V.E.N.
Welcome to Frog Talk. Today we're exploring how traditional service industries can build meaningful corporate cultures that create authentic competitive advantages. We'll examine how values-driven leadership can transform blue-collar businesses and create lasting differentiation in markets where branding is often an afterthought. I'm joined today by Jon Cahill, CEO of EverLine Coatings and Services in Boston, and chairperson of the United States Franchise Advisory Committee for EverLine. Jon leads a pavement maintenance company specializing in line painting, asphalt services, and warehouse floor markings, serving major clients including Tesla, Amazon, Walmart, and many property management firms. What makes Jon's perspective unique is his commitment to EverLine's driven D.R.I.V.E.N principles, values that are rare in the construction and facilities services space. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you, Nadir. It's great to be here.
I'm glad you're here. To begin, please tell me a bit about yourself. How did you start out? How did you end up here?
My background is primarily in graphic design and marketing is how I started out. So it kind of started out with a graphic design degree and then got into more marketing on the agency side, and then transitioned into in-house roles, director of marketing roles, that type of thing. And then I got involved with a business in the trades, which we grew here in Massachusetts successfully and quickly. And I was part of that senior team and decided I wanted to own my own business after 8 years with that company, and looked at franchising in general as a vehicle for doing that, and then came across EverLine after some research. And that was in 2022. I joined EverLine as the third franchisee in the United States.
That's cool. I am also a graphic design major. That's so funny. We both have degrees in graphic design and marketing. So then what drew you to specifically EverLine? How did you discover them actually? And what drew you to become the third franchisee in the US?
That the franchise, and I worked through a broker to look at different franchise organizations. I will say one of the first things that drew me to EverLine was the corporate team and their just their disposition and how they handled themselves. And it became clear to me that there were values behind what they were doing and what they were saying and how they were presenting themselves. And it was very reassuring. It was like, oh, I'm getting into business with people who really care about me, right? Or care about my business's success, right? So that was a huge driver for me in making the decision to buy in, and also continues to this day. I've obviously learned more about the company over the last few years and how we like to do things. So that's kind of how it happened.
The franchise model is so interesting to me because so we, D.R.I.V.E.N, my company is the culture branding agency. And so like what we focus on is really in simple terms, we make sure that what companies say matches what they do. And the bridge between those two sides, because usually there's this big gap between what companies say and what companies do. And the bridge between that gap is what I've designed as culture branding, where essentially you take your company values and apply it to every experience across the board, inside and outside of your company, so that ultimately when an employee and a customer meet for the first time, they actually tell the same story because they had the same experience. And so why the franchise model is so interesting to me, and it's been brought up many times. We've had prospective franchises as clients. We've never actually worked with a franchise, but I've always been asked about it because of the way that the individual franchise works in conjunction to the corporate side and how they sort of feed each other. But then there is an opportunity for, let's say, the franchise itself, the independent franchise, to have its own culture strategy and its own brand strategy in a way that's somewhat separated from corporate, but it's not completely. So in especially given your own expertise, your own sensibilities towards value driven environments and workforces and so on, how do you sort of tie the two together? And as you explore that, can you also walk me through the driven model of EverLine?
I think one thing that we try to do is communicate our corporate value whenever we're interacting with the corporate team or any members of the corporate team. We're hopefully acting within this value structure that we've created, and oftentimes we're very explicit. Like at the beginning of a meeting, we talk about a value, and we just focus on that and talk about it for a little bit. So it's constantly, we try to constantly put it at the forefront of everything we do. Um, our driven principles were designed by our founder, Jon Evans. We are dedicated, resourceful, integrity focused, value based, excelling, and nourishing. And each of those things encompasses quite a bit. So you're right. Like how I deploy those values here in my little neck of the woods with my team could vary slightly with how another franchisee does it, right? But that's okay. There are regional differences and cultural differences and so forth, right? But those are kind of the bedrock values that we move off of when we're interacting with clients, stakeholders, employees, vendors, you name it.
That's an interesting distinction. So would you disagree or agree that, like if would a culture branding program, if I were to, for example, apply a culture branding program to your office, that the appropriate way to do that would be through the lens of the corporate culture, in order to ensure that it's being passed through authentically and optimizing the experiences of both the employees and the customer?
I would say yes. And there's a few reasons why, but I think one of the most important ones is that, with well over 100 locations in North America now, these values become more and more important as we grow. Who do we let into the franchise system, right? How do we communicate with each other when we get together at national conference? There are regional meetings, there are FAC meetings, our franchise advisory council. So, having that consistency across the board in a fast growing franchise system, I think is important. Um, Personally, my values align. My personal values align with the company values, and that was just, I guess good luck for me. But it's helpful because I buy in. And so if you were coming to me as a consultant, this is the first thing I'd show you. I'd say these are our driven values here at EverLine. Let's talk about them, and then let's talk about what that means on the ground for my franchised operation here in Boston. That would be probably the way the conversation would go.
That's a good segue. As a chairperson of the U.S. Franchise Advisory Committee, how many franchises are you overseeing, first of all?
Well, in the United States, I think it's well over 100.
Given your stance and your own belief system, how do you help maintain culture consistency over 100 franchises?
As a member of the FAC, I'm available to any franchisee at any time if they want to talk to someone. We do a lot of surveys here at EverLine, and one of the surveys is, as we come up on our quarterly meetings, we ask for input from our franchisee members on what issues are important to them and issues that they would like us to talk about with our corporate office. So um, that's kind of the logistics of how it works. But again, you know, the values are kind of always in the room when we're having these discussions, if that makes sense. Like they've been repeated and talked about so many times that you almost start to um, you build traction with them, and then they become kind of assumed and practiced just by muscle memory, right? So I think that some of that's starting to happen with us, even though we're a very young organization in the United States. Um, these values continue to be very important, and they continue to be. We continue to leverage them as we grow.
Yeah, it's so cool to see, um, to see the values and belief systems of an organization actually start to be embodied. To actually like physically see people embodying them in specific within certain interactions, within certain conflict resolution matters, or anything like that. They show up in points of tension and contention, and when they do, and they're done with honor and ease, it's a very cool thing to watch.
Look, we're all human beings, and we fall short sometimes of um, of these values in our business, and so you're right. Those are times when you can really point back to the values and say, wait a minute, maybe I fell short here of what I espouse to be, right? And that's a that's humility in practice, right? So I think that's a very interesting point you bring up. We're not perfect, and we fall short.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just really like I'm actually getting goosebumps thinking about a few stories because like for example, we just delivered one of our programs for a big client here in Houston, and they don't, they're more systems people, they're kind of technical people. They're a creative company, but they're not, they're not familiar with the language of brand strategy and culture brand strategy specifically. And um, our rollout, like even during the build of the program, we already start training the team, the client team, and their leadership on how to even think about the brand and how to think about the culture and how to merge the two together, which is essentially embodying your belief system and then creating experiences that you want others to have. That's your culture brand. And so the and this because if a brand is a gut feeling about a person, place, or thing, then you want to do everything you can to make sure that every interaction at any given point manifests the feeling that you want them to have. And so like when I went into their office recently and was introducing the new brand strategy to some of the supervisors and middle managers and so on, because we're starting to train through the company. And the president, I think actually the COO came over because I said, "Do you want to check this out? You want to see their reactions?" And she said, "Can I?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely. Come in." And then she just kind of stepped in and started talking about it and explaining it in the language that we shared with her on how to talk about it. And she was thinking about it through our litmus test, culture brand filter, and so on. And it was just like, I was like, go, you're doing great. I don't even need to say anything. This is awesome. So yeah, it's a very cool thing to see it come to life through your own
Yeah, and I
people
think
and through the people you're helping.
the name of our company is EverLine Coatings and Services, right? And I think
Right.
sometimes we think of, oh, are you a product company or are you a service company? And for me, and I hope for our organization, services is a mindset, right? So the company values are really about buttressing how we serve our clients. We are in the service business.
Yeah.
And so what are the values we bring to that endeavor? And the service, it really gets at the service mindset, which is important too, as a service delivery organization.
So does that translate internally as well? Does that speak to how you treat each other, how you treat team members and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every hire is, we go through these driven values, and we even talk about examples. So a new employee will come in, I'll sit down with them and say, explain what our values are at this company and give concrete examples of what that means. So, integrity focused. I run this franchise above board. Everything's done, legally, properly. There's no shenanigans. So not only do we talk about the values, but then we give specific concrete examples so that they can latch on to something. Oh, okay, I know what he's talking about, right? So absolutely, this goes to, and again, when team members come up short on these values, we have something to go back to and talk about. It's not just, hey, you screwed up. It's, hey, these are the values we espouse around here. Let's talk about how we can align better with them moving forward, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a mediator, right? Like it also
Yeah.
makes conversations so much simpler because you have something to point to,
Yeah,
to
it's a
your point,
beacon,
as
right?
opposed,
It's an organizational beacon that's always there. And when
yeah,
you need to point to it and talk about it, you don't need to fumble around and say, oh, gee, how do I handle this situation? Or,
yeah, absolutely. Um, so in my experience, and as I said at the beginning, this kind of culture training and like very deliberate, intentional emphasis on cultivating the company culture and building the employee experience in a way that honors the values that you've instilled. Would you agree that that's unique in this industry, in your space, in your category?
in my experience, it is unique in the trades.
Yeah,
I'm not saying no one's doing it.
of course.
I'm
Yeah,
sure there are
but it's
companies that,
rare. Yeah.
in my experience, it tends to be rare. You know, why that is probably pretty complex. Um, I I would say it's not easy to do. Number one, it's not easy to do because it's kind of abstract, right? And we deal with, in our business, we deal with machines, and we put paint on the ground, and we're doing very, structured things. And so when it comes to some of these more abstract ideas, it's kind of tough to get them across sometimes. So I think that's part of why they're not widespread.
I agree. I agree. In most of my conversations about, let's call it it's not even resistance. It's just like the tension of the friction of introducing this kind of thing, because it's not really resistance. It's more like, I don't get it. People are just kind of like, they're technical people, people who do hard labor and this kind of stuff. They either don't care, or they don't get it, or care enough to get it. And it's a soft subject, like you said. It's abstract. It's a soft topic. It tends to deal with emotions, and a lot of, especially a lot of like male dominated technical industries, like, just to be blunt, like, they just care less. They just don't really care. I've come across a lot of organizations like that. But what's interesting is, if you can, this is where like the magic can happen, is with the scenarios where there's more friction. If you can create and instill a model, which it seems like you're doing, where the learning curve doesn't feel so forced. It doesn't feel like, oh, I have to go study something now or whatever, and like, this is going to interrupt and disrupt my work that I need to do to make a living. And it's something that is almost inherently learned. Like, unconscious adoption techniques kind of a thing, like learning by doing. And then they just start, to your point, embodying it and manifesting it and exemplifying the
Yeah,
values through
absolutely.
interactions. Then it's
Yeah,
that's where
absolutely.
the magic happens.
I agree. And I think a key to that for folks who are leading organizations is to walk the walk. You know, your actions will speak louder than your words. So if your actions are embodying and reflecting the values and you're doing that every day, they'll notice. They'll notice over time, and then they'll say, and then when you talk about the values, they're like, oh, well, so and so behaved consistent with that, right? Or my boss behaved consistent with that, or the owner of the company behaved consistent with that. So it's not just hot air; it's lived on a day-to-day basis. But you're right; it's a challenge because we ask team members to do physical labor, and and this can be abstract.
Would you say you've always been like, even when you were, when you were younger, when you were a kid in high school and college, driven by these like abstract values, purposefulness, as it were?
Yeah, very much so, which I think is why I kind of, when I was first introduced to the Everline driven values, it was like, yeah, fine, no problem. It's the way I was raised, it's the way I was educated. But this brings up an interesting point, especially for I think our young people, um, haven't been exposed to communities which, in many cases, they haven't been exposed to communities that have similar type of values. So, they're not joining the Cub Scouts. Maybe they don't go to church. Maybe they come from a broken home, um, and so your organization might be the first one that invites them into a community that has explicit values, right? Which is kind of a wild thing, but I'm aging myself, but um, that's I think it's fair to say that's the world we live in, where especially younger people coming into the workforce, they just haven't been exposed to this before in any kind of structured way, right? And so it becomes much more important in that context.
I really appreciate that you went there because, my philosophy is that the workplace is a microcosm for society, and it can be a model to create a better. Better is obviously a subjective word, but a more harmonious world where that is rooted in communication, that is rooted in values-driven interactions, and so on. Because you can use the workspace, the workplace, as a template for interactions in society. And my entire theory, my whole belief system is rooted in the fact that if you create a healthy workplace that is rooted in communications, transparency, honesty, reliability, and camaraderie, and so on, where the individual is uplifted as much as the collective, and vice versa, then you can create, you basically instill certain behavioral patterns of positive reinforcement and so on that are rooted in constructive criticism, in productivity, in and just collective growth, which instills joy, and those your workforce goes out into the community, and all their interactions are driven by the joy that they feel from working or being a part of this small community, and that permeates communities. And that's a pretty amazing, profound thing to think about, where like my whole idea is, if you can design that kind of a workplace and do that over and over and over again, then that feeling, those interactions permeate through society and ultimately create a better world. And to the point where you don't have to even really understand values or care about like what is the purpose of this company or what is our mission statement or whatever. because you will inherently feel it through what you're describing and what I talk about, which is the unconscious adoption techniques of the way that you train your people. They'll just be like, my day was just better, and it just keeps getting better. I don't really know why, but I know that it's better.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's kind of the idea. And then from a practical business standpoint, it's a point of differentiation for us. We're very vocal, and we push out, particularly on social media, quite a bit, our driven values of the company. Um, and to your earlier point, a lot of companies don't have that, and if they do have it, it tends to be more internalized, like a mission statement, right? But for us, it's very much an external thing that we want to talk about in the community, in the trades, in the construction space, that differentiates us. To the extent that helps our business, great.
Do you do check-ins? Do you do evaluations throughout the year of, what your customer experience is and what your employee experience is?
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. Some people do it much better than I do. Mine is more anecdotal. I
Okay.
mean, from a client standpoint, we have systems that during a project ongoing, we're making sure that satisfaction levels are high. And if they're not, we can respond. At the end of every job, I make sure that my client is highly satisfied. And sometimes they're not, and then I have to address that. Um, th- th- so yes, on the client side, on the team member side, it's like we talked about. It's like a daily reinforcement thing. It's a behavioral thing, where if I can show leadership that says he's behaving consistently with the values that he's told us about every day, that's how I think it happens. And typically, and this is the other thing I do, I always ask team members to let me know if there's something that's bothering them as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Because what I don't want to happen is that something festers for a week, they get more upset, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in, they're really mad, right? And then I'm dealing with a firestorm. I'd rather find out about it as early as possible, nip it in the bud, and we can all move on. So
Yeah.
to answer your question, with team members, it's very much a daily thing. When we meet in the morning, we talk about, we have a scrum process. We talk about the jobs of the day. We talk about what happened yesterday. We talk about safety. We talk about, is everyone good? We talk about our families, and we talk about life outside of work too. So
Yeah.
that's a daily thing.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah, there's a joke in my company where they say everyone's like, Nader will never get mad if you tell him the truth. He only gets pissed when you don't say anything. Because I'm the same. I'm like, I can't help you if I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, so it's about that daily communication,
Yeah.
and sometimes that goes well, and sometimes it's challenging, especially when we don't meet the expectations set out by our driven values.
You brought up an interesting point earlier about essentially serving your community, your local community, but both internally and externally, and how that might differentiate or differ rather from other franchisees, franchise offices, and so on. So, how do you balance maintaining EverLine's corporate culture while also adapting to your local Boston market needs or local community needs or otherwise?
In the spirit of, um, again, back to our values, integrity focused service delivery. Um, Sometimes you need to learn how to lose money. Sometimes you need to take, you know, if your service delivery, and then this happens on occasion to I think all service organizations. You don't meet the client's expectations for whatever reason, and you you go into service recovery mode. And sometimes that means losing money. Maybe you have to go back on site on a project and redo work, right? So um, maybe you have to refund money to your client. Whatever the service recovery mechanism is, it might mean losing money, and you need to. I've got a friend I stole this from, but you need to learn how to lose money sometimes. And and but but important to add to that is learn from that experience so it doesn't happen again, right? So okay, this happened here. We had a service failure, and how do we avoid this in the future with clients? Because it's not good for us, it's not good for the clients, it's not good for anyone. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that's what I thought of.
Do you have insight into the different markets that the various locations um, serve, and how is there an impact from the local? Because again, like corporate is serving. This is where the franchise model is interesting, because you have EverLine's customer demographic, right? You have EverLine's customer profile, um, and then you have your community demographics, your community customer profile. Are they one and the same? And then are you also serving, is your business particularly serving B2B, like other businesses, or are there individuals? Are there civilians, for example?
Yeah, no, it's B2B, but you know, it's about people. It's about relationships with other, folks in other organizations, right? I mean, to me, that's foundational in business is the relationships you have. It happens to be B&B, but that's almost, besides the point. In terms of service within the community, um, we all we all work in different regions around the country at Everline, and regions differ in a variety of ways for us. But I know for a fact that we reach into the community. We do volunteer work because I talk to my other franchisee partners, and I see their social media posts, and I see what they're up to and what they're doing, and and I think what you're suggesting is real. Like it's not just service to the B2B client. It's signaling to the community that we're a good member of the community that cares about our community, and um, participates and volunteers and donates money and so forth and so on. So that's very much part of it, I think, because if you align yourself with these values, how could you not, you know? How could you not be productive and interested member of your own local community, So those are the types of folks that I think Everline looks for to join the team. Um, to your point, is those folks who are inclined to get involved.
I said the almost same thing verbatim the other day. So my model has a power tool. It's basically that comes out of the program that we build. That's called the Culture Brand Filter, and it's the ultimate litmus test for any decision making across the board throughout an organization. From simple things like what kind of office pens should we get, all the way through, hiring and firing policies, and what kind of M&A endeavors should we engage, and so on. And the the elegance is in its simplicity, where it basically says, company does everything it does because it values X, Y, and Z and wants people to experience A, B, and C. So in our case, Black Rivet does everything it does because we value reliability, compassion, and deliberate action, and we want people to experience compassionate design. And I was saying, when I train, so I do the same thing. I pop quiz the team randomly every other week to recite the statement and define it and so on, and tell me, explain what the values mean and how they feed into each other. And I was saying the same thing. I said, when you honor every single one of these three foundational pillars in every interaction, you're always reliable, you're always compassionate, you're always deliberate. You will inherently create compassionate design experiences. And compassionate design just means that the person in the recipient of that interaction feels that that interaction was designed explicitly with them in mind. And so if you honor those three pillars at every touch point, then you're inherently creating compassionate design. And whether it's a customer and a team member, a peer, or just some random passerby, they will always feel that feeling.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with that. I would add that you're also building a trust-based relationship with a framework like you just described. I would imagine that team members uh, would never take advantage of a stakeholder's vulnerability, right? So baked into some of these values we've been talking about is the building of trust-based relationships, in business and otherwise, in the community or in, you know, um, so you, the more you evidence these values, I would argue that the better your relationships will be, and people will trust you more.
Agreed. Because what is the root of trust? Consistency. It's just showing up. If you just do what you say and do it over and over, like just do the same thing over and over again, then you start building trust. And the irony of that is that do the same horrible thing over and over again, and people will trust that you will always be horrible. So like it's just about consistency. And if you embody and implement and instill the values, whatever they are, over and over and over again, to your point, then every interaction will have that expectation, whether it's an employee, a team member, or a customer, or a random person.
Yes, and I think from a business standpoint, oftentimes those trust-based relationships have very positive business implications, including financial implications, around price sensitivity, around share of wallet, around other metrics that your business might be looking at when it comes to selling your products or services. So it's not just all kind of, for lack of a better word, feel good stuff. Um, there are some real practical business advantages to operating your organization in this manner, right?
Oh, 100%. And I think that's therein lies the rub, because that's where many people, business leaders as well, don't make the connection because it's soft, right? So they're like, how does this actually help? What does this do for my bottom line? How does this line my pockets, et cetera? Like the same questions that, since the beginning of time. And that's the point, and studies will consistently show over and over and over again since the 80s, when this became more of a highlight, and employee well-being became a highlight, and then COVID completely just catapulted it into the limelight. That healthy cultures, engaged employees, healthy cultures, cultures of acknowledgement, purpose-driven, just productivity. And this as well, joy and happiness are not the same thing, right? Happiness is fleeting, joy is sustained. And one of the main ingredients of joy is actually feeling productive and contributing, to feel like your day was actually worth something, and that it was acknowledged, and that your efforts were acknowledged. Doesn't mean you were praised. It just means that you were seen, and that you were heard, and that you were listened to. And there is reciprocity in your interactions. That directly correlates with a higher profit margin, higher revenue, higher retention in customers, higher retention in employees across the board.
The business philosophies around what we've been discussing, um, are I think by definition long-term strategies. In other words, when you're talking about culture and corporate values, where you're talking long-term, you know, you're talking long-term here. These aren't short-term hits, or oh, what am I going to get out of this next week? This is real long-term strategy that I think a lot of successful companies have recognized and deployed and support ongoing. And there is no end date on this type of thing.
How do you see the role of culture and branding evolving in the blue collar category?
I think it's going to be a competitive imperative. In other words, if companies like EverLine and other companies can successfully implement these values throughout their organization, and it translates into success, then wow, maybe we should pay attention to this. So I think that um, it's something in the trades, I think, that is really could be a competitive advantage.
I agree. I think it's a miss, and companies like your own are setting a really good example. It's definitely it's. I feel like people are starting to get on board, but again, it's an uphill battle because it's it's not something that's readily accessible. It's not something that's understood right away.
Right. And I think it takes a certain amount of faith that by establishing these values and following them and attempting to practice them every day, that your company will get better. And for I think for a lot of folks, that's kind of might be a little bit of an article of faith, but so be it.
I also appreciate that you brought up the word faith because I actually use this analogy often. Especially if you're a religious person, if you believe in God, if you have faith in, an all-encompassing power, whatever, however you want to label it, in your own faith, then you're following certain guidelines and certain parameters and values and so on in order to honor that faith, to honor that deity, that power that you look up to, that you believe is a protective force in your life. So why not do the same thing when it comes to your people and running your organization and so on? It's still a construct system. It's still a value-based system. It's still a system that's driven by values. And interestingly enough, both are equally abstract and equally tangible because the outcome is tangible. The outcome is actually measurable. You can measure the success of culture and brand uh, by instilling the systems and processes within an operation. It's crazy to think about, like operationalizing culture and brand.
You're right. I mean, I think a lot of these ideas come from foundational faith-based practices. So they're not necessarily unique in that way, but um, there are very old and tried and true ideas out there that they might be based on, right? And so I hear
Yeah.
you 100%. For speaking personally, and I've got to credit my parents. I was raised in a faith practice that makes adhering to my company values very easy. I don't have any built-in objections. I don't.
Yeah.
In fact, they all made kind of it organically just made sense to me right away. So it was, you know, it, if you're aligned in that way, it might be helpful with these
Yeah.
types of values, at work, not to mix religion and business necessarily in the workplace, but to say, if you're a person who has some experience with some of these foundational philosophies, like these values can come a little easier to you.
And again, I agree. It's not about mixing the two, because in my opinion, they're kind of one and the same. It's like, this is your business, that is your faith, but they're sort of ruled by the same rules, the same guidelines. So last question, what advice would you give to other leaders in traditional industries who want to build more intentional, values-driven cultures?
Establishing your company's values. And again, it's fine to have a mission statement for the business. That's great, but 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 the outward values that you're trying to espouse in your people, and look, these values might be different for different businesses. It depends in large part what you're trying to achieve, right? But having some kind of beacon out there to both point to and then to fall back on, I think is very important, especially in the trades, as we're trying to attract younger people into this arena. Mike Rowe's very good with this. There's 7.5 million job openings in the trades right now, according to Mike Rowe, and there's a ton of work to be done, and we're trying to bring team members on board to help us get this work done, right? And this idea of consistent values can I believe really help in attracting and retaining motivated and, as you put it, joyful team members.
Jon, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Please tell our audience how they might be able to locate you if they want to get in touch with you.
Oh gosh, I think no surprise, the website is probably a good place to go. EverLineCoatings.com. We have operations both in Canada and the U.S. We have a really good footprint now across North America, so no job too big for us. And obviously, we work within our own local territories as well. So start at the website, I'd say, would be the best way to get a good idea of us, and then from there you can contact folks who are in your particular local area.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks again, Jon. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Nadir.